The Open Source Creative Podcast, episode 51, HDRI Haven and Friends with Greg Zaal. This is the Open Source Creative Podcast, a podcast where I ramble on about creativity, process, and open source software. I'm Jason Van Gumster, your host and driver on the road to creative freedom. Still working on the tagline part of that. Anyway, this time around, we get to talk to Greg Zaal. Greg runs HDRI Haven, a website that provides high dynamic range images that you can use for 3D scenes, image processing, image compositing, and other fun stuff like that. And it provides all of that under a CC0 license, as a Creative Commons 0 license. It's essentially public domain. HDRIs from his site have already been used in all kinds of different things and are in a bunch of other software as well. In fact, if you're a Blender user, chances are good that you've already used them and maybe didn't even know that yet. Greg's also involved with some other Haven sister sites, Texture Haven and 3D Model Haven, which also use the same basic model. We'll be talking about that as well. On a show-related matter, commenting. I got it working. Finally, I have commenting set up on the site using ISO as the comment engine. So I set that up on a virtual private server, and now we have comments per episode. I was actually even able to migrate the old Disqus comments over to the ISO server that I'm running. So you can, if you made comments in the past and they're tied to an episode, they're still there. There's only about 30 of them or so, but the fact that they're there, kind of awesome. Very cool. And so that's very awesome. And on top of that, you may have noticed I have a new, better mic relative to last show, because last show I was using a very old mic, and I talked about that. But this one's a fancy schmancy. It's a Rode Pod mic, in case anybody's curious about that. Make sure I was telling you what it was. It's a Pod mic. It actually works really, really well, and it is super heavy. And hopefully, the sound quality is something that you're amenable to and you like. Also, I haven't done an episode in a number of weeks now, probably 2 months worth of weeks. Sorry about that. In any case, but I have been still doing podcast things in the meantime. I've been regularly showing up to the Linux Lugcast. If you guys aren't aware of Linux Lugcast, it is a Linux users group that meets via the web. They've done it for a long time. I've been showing up on and off for a while. So I've been going to Linux Lugcast. It's actually a really cool thing where, because it's a Linux users group, if you happen to use Linux and you want to talk to other people who use Linux, you can actually go on and join the Mumble server where they have a show. It's like the second and third Friday of every month, and you can actually go and just be part of the show. You can listen in live, or you could actually talk on it. It actually is involving real user participation. So if you're down, you should come check it out. Chances are good I'll probably be there as well, so be fun. The other thing is, I've been a guest host on a couple not guest host, but I've been guesting on a couple of other podcasts. So the Survival Podcast and Floss Weekly, I was recently a guest on both of those shows in the last 2 months. And so if you're coming from those shows, hi, welcome to the Open Source Creative Podcast. This is kind of how that goes. Me rambling on. Sometimes we have interviews, and there's video of me moving my hands all crazy like, because that's just the way things work. For those of you who are in audio, I move my hands real crazy like, because you can't see me do that in video. Anyhow, that's that. We're gonna get ourselves over to the interview. One quick note before I do this: I don't really have an interest in sponsored subscription things, so I pay for my own hosting and time to produce the show on my own. But if you like it and you want to help me cover those costs, I do write books, and I have a few things of merchandise type things for sale on the Open Source Creative website. It's opensourcecreative.org. There's a little section there for that, and you can go through and get a t-shirt or a coffee mug or those sort of things, and I would be greatly appreciative of that. If any of that appeals to you. If it doesn't, that's fine too. All right, well, let's get to this interview.
Oh, we're going to toast marshmallows, are we? Could be. Better.
All right, everyone. So I have here with me, proper English, Greg Zaal, pronouncing it properly.
Close enough.
I'm going to get it right one day, just not today. From HDRI Haven and the whole realm of various havenses. Um, so, Greg, can you give us the general background on who you are? We'll get to the havens in a moment, but tell folks who you
Oh
are.
man, that's a complicated story. I struggle. Like anytime anybody asks me, like, so what do you do for a living? I'm like, um, so there's some of this and some of that, and it takes me like 10 minutes just to try and explain everything.
We got
I've
plenty of
been
time.
I've been around. Uh, I mean, I started using Blender like high school, which for me was like 10 years ago or something like that. And from there, I kind of just jumped straight into the deep end. I got an internship. I skipped the whole like college university thing. Got an internship at a studio, worked there for a while, and slowly realized I kind of just want to do my own thing. I don't particularly like working on like advertising and things like that. I was keen on getting into film or game design, but never really happened. Basically, slowly I started working on my own projects. I got a camera, started messing around with HDRIs. I started selling HDRIs, and that worked interestingly. Um, it was okay, but like when I was selling HDRIs, I kind of started to feel like there weren't as many people benefiting from my work as I wanted. Like there were, I was like making sales and things, but like what I really enjoyed was when people would show me their renders and things, and that didn't really happen when people would purchase a product and then they'd use it in their commercial, whatever.
So, just to back up for a second, for the people
Yeah,
who listen to this that might not know what it is, what is an HDRI?
good question. All right, so it is basically a 360-degree panorama, exactly like you'd see on Google Street View, where you can look around in all directions, up and down. But the difference is that an HDRI contains all of the lighting information as well in all directions, including if you do it properly, like the full brightness of the sun or any light sources and things like that. And the purpose is so that you can basically copy paste the lighting and the reflections from the real world into your scene in Blender or whatever software you're using.
Okay, so it's a high dynamic range image is the you can
Yeah,
yeah, got
yeah,
it.
cool. So yeah, I was selling these things for a while, and I kind of felt like I was happier when people would just show me what they did, and I wanted to see like what would happen if I started releasing these things for free instead of selling them. Um, and at the time, like since the beginning, I would always like release the lowest resolution for free, the 1K size. And then I decided every Friday I would release one that was completely for free up to the full resolution, and that was really popular. So I thought, okay, let me take a risk. At the time, I was living with my parents and I was pretty financially stable. So I was like, all right, if this completely falls over, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to release everything I've got for free. I'll take the website down for a month so that I don't piss off any like previous customers. You don't want to like buy something and then the next day like, oh, it's for free now. That was a
Right,
waste.
right.
So I had a couple of people who still emailed me about that, but anyway. And yeah, so it was a surprising success. It only took about 6 months for the donations on Patreon to catch up with what I was earning from selling the HDRIs, which was a big surprise to me. And it's only grown since there, and it's working really well.
So let me sort of encapsulate this in my own dumb way of saying it. So you had a small business of selling high dynamic range images that people would
Yeah,
use in their 3D scenes for basically lighting and covering the environment.
yeah.
And um, you stopped selling them and you gave them away for free under a Creative Commons license,
Um,
or is it just public
it
domain?
was public domain, so
Okay.
CC0. It's technically a Creative Commons license, but it's basically public domain.
Okay, so CC0. So you released it under CC0, and you within 6 months you were making as much as previously, and now you're still growing.
Yeah,
Does that cover
yeah.
all that? Okay,
Hmm.
that's kind of awesome, right? So
Yeah.
I mean that's the poster child for what we talk about in on the, always a question when it comes to Creative Commons, free culture, open source software is, well, how do you make all your money? Well, this, and it's not just because the how is an answer. The question is, yeah, but does that actually make money? And that's reassuring and useful to know, because um there's not enough people, I think, sort of taking that leap that you took, and really sort of,
Yeah.
you see, like, you've seen, like, in the music industry, you'll see, like, big name artists will do the pay what you want model for, they'll release a song or an album or whatever, and they'll do pay what you want. And they've experimented with that, and anytime that there's been any success there, people says, yeah, but they were already big, they already had it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's really, it's gratifying, really, to see that it's not limited to that. It works pretty well.
Hmm.
um
I mean, there are some caveats to why it was successful for me.
okay.
And first of all, that's because I could afford to take the risk.
Right.
But secondly, I live in South Africa, which our living costs are really, really low compared to like the US and Europe and most of the rest of the world. So for me, what is like an acceptable income would be very little for somebody in, first world countries. I wouldn't say the majority of the world, because, like populations in India and China and whatever, they also have fairly low living costs compared to Europe and the US. So that was a big reason why it worked for me. Yeah, there are many reasons that I don't fully understand, but
and so now you've done, there's not just HDRI Haven now, there's other havens.
Right. So HDRI Haven in its current form, where we're giving away everything for free and supported purely by donations, has been around for about 3 years. I think just over 3 years. And then about 2 years ago, I think it was about 2 years ago, I got in contact with Rob Tootle. I'm not really sure how to pronounce his last name, but he was the guy who worked on Tears of Steel in the Blender Institute. And he has a Udemy course where he teaches like Blender environment creation, and he wanted to make a platform to publish his textures and photo scans and things like that. And he hired me briefly to work on that. That didn't last particularly long. We eventually started talking, and he was on the same wavelength as me, as wanting to release everything for free. So we started Texture Haven together, and he's the driving force behind that whole site. He's producing all of the textures for that. So that's about 2 years that's been running. Exactly the same model, where he creates CC0 textures, releases them for free, and supported by donations. This year we started 3D Model Haven, which is the same thing, but now we have 3D models as well as textures and HDRIs. It has been a bit less successful for a variety of reasons, but the future is interesting. I might as well mention now, we're planning to next year merge these 3 Haven websites into one site, just to make things simpler for us, because the guy who was running the 3D Model Haven has left. So I'm kind of taking care of that, or supposed to be, but I'm struggling to find the time for it. And then Rob is doing the textures and stuff, but he needs a little bit of help with the administration side and like giving patrons their rewards and things like that. So we're going to be combining all of our efforts together and just making one website that does exactly the same thing.
Very cool. Now, are all of the assets on HDRI Haven, Texture Haven, 3D Models Haven, are all those created by you and Rob, and or do you guys take like submissions for that as well?
Okay, so for Texture Haven, everything there is Rob's.
Okay.
For HDRI Haven, originally everything was mine, and then because like the donations were growing and growing, and I started like promising to publish a certain number of HDRIs every month, I slowly started to realize I couldn't really keep up with what I was promising. I could do it, but I have other interests I want to explore as well. I don't want that to be my only thing that I do with my life. So I started hiring some other people to shoot HDRIs for me, and it took a bit of time to like teach them my workflow and how to do it properly. Because at the time, they were pretty much, I couldn't think of like a single person who knew how to shoot HDRIs properly, where like you include the whole dynamic range of the sun and light source and stuff. So it took a bit of time to teach them, but currently like 80-90% of all the HDRIs I publish are from other people. It's mainly a guy, Sergey, who's in Ukraine, and Andreas, who's in Germany at the moment, and they shoot HDRIs every month that we publish, and I do one a month of my own usually. So that's how it's been working for the last year or so, which has been pretty good. 3D Model Haven is different because how it started was I always knew that it would be more difficult to make it succeed, because the amount of effort required to create a 3D model is higher than an HDRI or a texture, depending on the model. Like if you just want to make a teacup or something, it can take you 10 minutes. But if you want to make a whole character or a battleship or something like that, it's going to take a long time. And then, but the potential, there's theoretically more people who might want to use models than HDRIs. Maybe. But so I knew it would be harder to make it succeed. And the other aspect is that there are already a lot of places to get 3D models, like TurboSquid and BlendSwap and all these other places. I don't know of any that does public domain, but not a lot of people care about CC0. It's an important point for me, for the main reason being that basically when somebody downloads it, they don't have to care about the license. They can just do whatever they want. Right. Especially big like companies and things, they care more. But somebody who's doing it as a hobby, they don't care if it's public domain or CC BY, or even if they just downloaded it from some suspicious website. They're just going to use it for fun. Right. But for me, it's a big point. So for Model Haven, I didn't want to start it for a long time. It was something people always suggested was, you've got the HDRIs and the textures. Why don't you do the models now? It makes sense. Right. So eventually I thought, okay, I'm going to apply for a grant from Epic Games. They have a system called the Mega Grants, where they just have a bunch of money that they want to give away. I think a little while ago they gave the Blender Foundation like $1 million or something crazy like that.
Yeah, they've been throwing into a lot of open source projects between Blender. I think Krita got a big chunk of change.
Right.
I can't remember this. There's at least one other big one that I can remember.
Yeah. So anyway, I applied for a grant, and I thought, you know what, I might as well ask. If we don't get the grant, it probably won't work out. So I asked for, not sure if I'm allowed to say, but I asked for a bunch of money, and they gave us like less than half of that. Okay. And I thought, you know what, it's probably enough. So I worked with my friend Cameron. We used to do Blender tutorials together. Right on. And he just finished studying animation and game design or something. So it was a good time for him to work on this project with me. And we were planning to create a whole lot of our own assets for the site. But for a variety of reasons, that didn't really work out. So instead, Cameron approached a whole bunch of other artists on ArtStation and stuff and said, can I give you a whole bunch of money to like give you this asset that we can publish? So that's where the majority of our existing content comes from. It's just like buying it off of artists to allow us to publish it as CC0. And that's okay, but I think it didn't work that well because it's not really sustainable with our funding method. Right. We can't really afford to do that. Like the 3D Model Haven gets $400 a month, which is enough for like 1 or 2 assets a month. And that's not really enough to like grow the platform and grow the income to allow us to get more assets and things like that. Ideally, Cameron would have carried on working on his own assets to publish on the site, but he ended up finding a job that would actually be able to pay his bills. So he went in that direction, which is perfectly understandable. Yeah. For me, I'm lucky enough that I have HDRI Haven and I have some other smaller projects I run on the side, so I don't have to worry about paying the bills too much, which is extremely freeing, I think is the word. Anyway, so the reason we're combining the three havens together now is to allow us to more easily distribute like the funding between the three sites, because currently all three of them are completely independent. So
Right.
all of the donations we get from HDR Haven are used for like creating HDRIs. They go directly to Sergey and Andreas and myself for shooting. Rob does his own thing. I'm not particularly involved in that. And Model Haven can't really afford to do much. So the idea is to reduce, like spend a bit less on HDRIs, because we already have like 420 or so HDRIs on the site. And there's only so many different types of clouds and skies and things that you can shoot. So it seems like a good idea to slow that down a bit. We're gonna still keep publishing HDRIs, but we're gonna take some of that funding and put it into textures and models as well. So basically, I'm starting a studio down here in South Africa. I'm gonna be hiring a couple of artists, and we're gonna be working on models and textures together. And that will allow us to create models and textures that like live together better. They're more in the same style, which I think is quite important, because currently with the method that we went with of just like approaching random artists and saying, hey, this looks cool, can I buy it from you? That gets us some good art, some good assets, but everything's kind of disconnected, where if somebody finds a particular style of couch on our website, and then they want to put that in their scene, then okay, is there like a double couch? Is there like a coffee table that matches the style? No, there's not. There's just one. So if we can like work on a particular scene and different textures together in one kind of theme, I think that would make a lot more sense.
Right on. So and I guess that's who's in the like the people who purchase models. That's gonna, or not purchase in this case, for 3D Model Haven, that download that. I mean, there's the use case for that is varied, right? You have architectural.
Right.
I'm sure architectural visualization uses it a lot for interior
Yeah.
design and those sort of things. But yeah, you can also see it in if you're a graphic designer and you need a 3D thing that is a slightly different angle. Having that married with textures would be actually really, really beneficial.
Yeah.
For that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Bouncing back to the HDRI thing.
Mhm.
What is the workflow used? Just for the time being, just talk about the shooting side of that. Are you just doing bracketed shots, or do you have a specific type of camera that you use for that, or how does that work out?
No, you could use pretty much any SLR camera or mirrorless or whatever. You could technically use your phone depending on the scene. So the basic workflow is to shoot exposure brackets of different angles to cover the whole 360-degree scene. And the key point for HDRIs in terms of using them for lighting in Blender is to make sure that you capture like the light sources completely, which often means using like an ND filter in front of the lens to darken it even further than your camera can allow. Like most cameras can go up to like 1/8,000th of a second, which is like an imperceivably short amount of time. But even that is not nearly dark enough to like shoot the sun so that it's unclipped. It's still going to be like overexposed, and it's going to be like completely white in your image, which is what we call clipped. So you put some ND filters in front of the lens to darken it even further. An ND filter is just like basically like sunglasses for a camera. Makes the image really dark, and that allows you to shoot the sun so that you can actually see the disk of the sun, a little bit of shading, and if your resolution is high enough, maybe like some sunspots or whatever. That's the theory anyway. And then you do that for the entire 360-degree view, up and down and everything. And then you combine those exposure brackets into HDR files. So then you have like around 30 different HDR files of different angles of your scene. And then you dump that into a stitching program. I use PT GUI, and it kind of detects similar areas in the image, in the different images. If you overlap them by like 30%, then it will find a couple of pixels that match and stitch it together into a panorama. and then you've got an HDRI.
How much painting to cover mist stitches do you have to go through doing on that?
None.
Really?
Yeah. No, you just shoot everything. Just shoot all directions, and if you think you might have missed something, just shoot it again. It doesn't really matter.
So you're doing you said about 30 shots to get
Yeah.
the full 360, and how many steps brackets are you doing up and down?
So that depends entirely on like the lighting on the scene itself. So if you're shooting on like an overcast day, you could technically get away with like a single image. But generally the minimum that I would do is 3 shots that are spaced by 2 exposure values, EVs, or stops is another word. And 1 EV is like double or half the amount of light. So 2 EVs is like quadruple. So anyway, 3 shots separated by 2 EVs each is like the bare minimum. That I do on like an overcast day or any kind of interior scene that doesn't have any small bright light sources. But if you're dealing with an outdoor scene, especially if the sun is visible, or even indoor, if you have some like really bright lights with like a little filament that's a millimeter thick or something like that, it's might not emit a lot of light, but it's really, really small. So it's really, really bright in that tiny area. So then you have to shoot, most cameras will do 5 or 7 brackets spaced by 2 EVs or 3. But usually that's not enough for a lot of cases. So then you basically shoot the entire panorama with those exposure brackets. And then you would shoot the light source again with another set of exposure brackets to get an even wider range just of that area. And then you do some magic in Photoshop or whatever to stitch it all together and make sure it's correct. The challenge is because the purpose is to copy paste the lighting from the real world into Blender.
Right.
So the challenge is to make sure you're staying physically accurate. So your images, your whole workflow is like linear. You're not doing any kind of color adjustments or contrast changes or anything like that.
How important is having a fixed starting point? Is that rolling around on a tripod, or can you just stand there and sort of move around?
I would say it's quite important. You definitely, okay. So some people get away with what they do is they like attach a piece of string and a weight to their camera so they can do it handheld. And then the weight, like they can put the weight on the floor or like hang it over a piece of paper or something to try and make sure that the camera is in exactly the same place as they shoot. There is a little bit of wiggle room. It's more important the closer things are to the camera. So if you're shooting like a wide open field, it's probably not hugely important. But if you're shooting indoors, then the more you move around, even just a couple centimeters or millimeters, the more the perspective will shift. And that can end up with some issues in the stitching where things will struggle to align and you might end up with some seams in different places. Generally, you can hide the seams quite well. Especially if it's outdoors. Something a lot of people ask me when they're talking about shooting HDRIs is like, what happens when the sky is completely clear? Like it's just a blue sky. How do you stitch different images that are all just solid blue? There's no clouds or anything. And the truth is you can't, but also it doesn't matter because there's nothing in the sky where you would be able to recognize a seam. So if it's like off by 100 pixels or something, it doesn't matter because you can't see the seam.
I would imagine a windy day would actually be more problematic where like,
it is.
The entire sky is moving.
Yes, that's a big issue. It's really annoying. You have to
we're not going to expect a lot of HDRIs in a hurricane anytime soon.
I'd love to try. I've done some like just before a thunderstorm where the clouds are moving quite a lot. And the stitching software tries its best, and then it will give you a giant error that says like your control points are way off from each other, something seriously wrong. But it kind of looks okay. But you can always export. There's an option to like export each image, but as it is projected into the panorama separately. So then you can like manually merge them together and put the seams where you want them to be and like blend the clouds together and things like that. It's a lot more work when there's motion involved, but you can work with it. The fun part is that once you're done, nobody will ever know that it was a problem. So,
and since this is the open source creative podcast, I do have to ask. One is the first is are there tools in the open source tool suite that could do this for if someone wanted to do it on their own? And the second one obviously would be the obvious one. Why aren't you doing that?
All right, so I use Raw Therapy, which is an open source raw processing program. I used to use Lightroom, but it gave me issues and it's actually annoying. Raw Therapy is, objectively speaking, if you're purely interested in the technical aspects, like if it's a priority for you to remain linear and be in full control over what happens to your image in order to like most accurately copy paste the lighting into Blender, it's way better than any other software I've used. Then once you process the raw files, you get to merge them into HDR images, and I use Blender for that. I've got a script that uses the compositor to like adjust the exposures of each bracket and merge them all together based on which part of each image is best exposed. And I've published that script on my GitHub page as well, and some people have used it. I think Sibrin Stuvel used to use it a bit. He helped me with some of it as well. So that's all open source so far. The only part of my workflow that's not open source is the stitching software, which is PTGUI. And that costs like $170 or something once off for a perpetual license. There is an open source alternative called Hugin or some such pronunciation. Yep. And it's all right for stitching regular panoramas. If you're just taking like photos of a landscape and you want to stitch them into a pretty picture, that's cool, it works fine. If you want to stitch a 360-degree environment that's not an HDRI, so just a straight up panorama, a low dynamic range image, JPEG or whatever, it also works fine. But when you try to combine that, when you try to make an HDR 360-degree panorama, it becomes, for me, last time I tested it anyway, which was probably a couple of years ago, it becomes a bit unusable. Like it's extremely slow and the results you get are not very good. And I'm sure that if you had enough time and you cared enough, you could probably get as good results. But from all of the testing that I did, it was just worth it for me to buy the commercial option and save time. And I'm fully an open source advocate, but I'm also like an advocate for spending your time efficiently.
Sure. I just blanked out on what my next question was going to be. Oh, no.
That's cool.
It's totally going to get not cut out at all. So actually, some of the HDRIs from HDRI, oh man, I can't speak today. Some of the HDRIs from HDRI Haven are now, they ship with Blender, right? That's some of the studio lighting that comes with the Blender 2.8 series, 2.9. Those are your images, right?
Yeah. I mean, so everything we publish is public domain. So like nobody even has to ask me if they want to do that. They can just dump it in their software. And they have in a couple of other programs. I think the AMD Pro Renderer, I don't know if they do, but I know they emailed me a long time ago to ask if they could. Some Autodesk software, I can't remember what it was, might be Fusion 360. I don't know. There's a couple different software where they have our stuff included by default. But because it's public domain, you don't even have to ask. That's the whole purpose of why we're using CC0 over something like CC BY or anything like that, or any like customized license.
Well, and
because
go ahead.
Our whole purpose is like to make things as open as possible. Like one of the big reasons that for a long time Blender was not adopted in the industry, like now it's pretty big, but like a couple of years ago, one of the main reasons that Blender was not super adopted in the industry was because third-party tools like render engines and things like that didn't want to get into Blender because of the GPL license, where it's open source, that's great, but it also restricts like how you're allowed to use the Blender code. And in some cases, that's a really good thing because it prevents people from abusing the open source license. But it is still an inhibition to other companies wanting to get into that industry and to use Blender for different reasons, or to put their cool third-party software into Blender. So for me, it was an important point to make it extremely, like, basically free of copyright. And I think I'm not like a copyright lawyer, but basically public domain is the lack of copyright. So
Right.
there are still some, when you're using CC0 instead of public domain, there are some differences, but basically it's free of copyright. So people can literally do anything that they want with it. If they want to re-upload it to a store and charge for it, they can, legally speaking.
Right.
Just like people do that for Blender. And that has happened. In some cases, the managers of the store are like, that's not really cool of you, you know, and they'll take it down, or they'll just leave it there. But that's kind of, that comes with the territory. That's just a risk that we take.
Right on. But and it's really one of those things where having that, especially when it comes to assets and stuff like that, having that reusability is really beneficial. The headache of every time, if you wanted to do attribution for every time it gets used for especially a what's essentially a background asset or something that is a contributory asset, trying to like flash up, if you're doing it like in a TV commercial, flash up, oh, the background was used for that, you know,
you can't
really
exactly
do that.
Like, although the CC BY license, there's nothing in it about like preventing use in commercial purposes.
Right.
You can't put like a credit screen at the end of every advert. So
right. So what I've seen is that sometimes for when you have something CC by, whoever is trying to use it will say, like, I'm trying to use this in a thing where it doesn't have credits. Can we get like a workaround? And that's one of the things where you do have that sort of flexibility with a Creative Commons license, because public domain, depending on where you live, public domain usually is one of those things that just happens automatically after a period of time. CC0 is a means of getting you the status of public domain without necessarily having to wait that long. The caveat, of course, is that you can still do dual licensing if you felt like it.
Sure, yeah, you can. You can, I think it probably depends on the country, but you can just voluntarily dedicate something to the public domain. You don't have to wait however long. The reason that CC0 exists is because in some countries, public domain is not a thing, or there are some limitations to it, like you have to still maintain liability for your creation. You can't just say, hey, this is not my problem anymore.
Somebody takes an HDRI with great lighting and goes into a VR environment with proper projection and blinds themselves by looking at the sun. Make yourself liable for that.
Yeah, exactly. And there's other things like like model release forms. Like if you have a recognizable person in your photo and you publish that online, like you can probably get sued for if that person doesn't want their face visible online. So there's still like some legal infrastructure to it, but essentially we don't want to give anybody any kind of restrictions to how they can use our work, for better or for worse.
That would also, I mean, in the case of an HDRI, I mean, you don't see very many HDRIs that involve people simply because people
I removed them.
People tend to move and they make it complicated, and you end up shooting in an open space. Though, I mean, I think they're from a lighting perspective, there could be, but then again, you'd kind of want it to move. Where is HDRI technology when it comes to video at this point? I mean, it's hard to bracket and shoot video that's HDRI all at once.
Yeah. So you do have cameras that can shoot 360 video, obviously. And there are probably some that can shoot 360 video in RAW, which is technically, depending on your definition, HDRI, because it's higher than 8-bit, like JPEG or whatever is 8-bit, and then RAW video is usually, I'm not sure about video, but RAW photo is usually 12 or 14-bit. And each bit is a stop, so it's double the amount of information. So like add a couple of extra bits, and that's a huge amount of information that you've got. So technically you have raw video, and there's probably 360 raw video. The main issue is that for our purposes, for lighting in Blender, it's super, super important to have the lights unclipped. If you even miss out like on a little bit of clipping on your sun, suddenly that means the sun is no longer like a warm yellow. It's clipped to completely white. So then the color of the lighting is wrong and the intensity of the lighting is wrong. And that makes a really big difference inside Blender if you even miss out on a couple of bits of information. So for any 360 camera, that I know, dedicated 360 camera. They use like fisheye lenses that are super wide angle, and a couple of them. And you can't really put an ND filter onto those kind of lenses.
Right.
So you can't shoot an HDRI that is unclipped if the light source is really bright. You could do it if it's like an overcast day or whatever, no problem. But that's the main issue. There is another option of just using multiple cameras. That would be the way to go if you were seriously trying to do HDR video. It would just be very expensive. Yeah, like at least 6 different SLR cameras in a small little bundle with ND filters on them.
And they haven't gotten much lighter over the years. Trying to have
not really.
ball of HDR of SLRs.
Yeah, every now and then there's a company that's like, all right, we're going to release a brand new mirrorless camera that's like super lightweight. And then the lenses that you get for it are just as big. And then the next generation of camera, they're like trying to improve it, and it just gets bigger and heavier. And they, now they're defeating the whole purpose. But one of the things I want to do in future is to make HDRIs from a drone, which would be super cool. Like one of the, apart from just being super cool, one of the main reasons, the main uses for HDRIs is to get like the sky and the weather and things like that, which means you don't want to have any like trees or buildings nearby to you. You want to be like in a flat open field. And that's actually really difficult to find. So one workaround for that would be just to get above the trees and the buildings. That could work really well. That's what I want to try.
Does that change the perspective when you pull that into a 3D scene, be it in Blender or whatever? Does that change the horizon line, or is the aspect
probably
far
not
enough away that it doesn't matter?
It's probably not the horizon line itself. Obviously, it'll look like you're floating in the sky, like a bird or a plane or something. So I don't think people would really be interested in using that for backgrounds, but mainly just for like the sky, the weather, and things like that. Different types of sunsets and whatever. Yeah, nobody would like try to put a car or a character into that environment because it just look like they're floating in space. So I want to try that. The challenge is mainly a weight issue, I think, like getting a drone to fly up a bundle of SLRs that can just take an HDRI remotely. It requires some research to figure out how that's going to work.
There's a bit of engineering, I think, that's involved with that one.
Yeah,
because trying to get the quadcopter to sort of steadily do that rotation in place is going to be that's not trivial.
No, exactly. I think it's possible. It just needs some dedicated time to figure it out.
Right. Well, that'd be cool. I'll keep an eye out to see if that actually happens.
Yeah.
And how that happens, because if it will, just how
someday.
Someday, no problem. So when it comes to using an HDR, since we're talking about the making of them and producing them and stuff like, there are opinions about the proper way to use HDRIs for environments. Do you use a lamp? Do you not use a lamp in addition to it? How do you tweak out your lighting source? What's your recommendation on that? How do you suggest people use your HDRIs?
So for our HDRIs, for any HDRI that is been shot in a way and processed in a way that has basically copy pasted the lighting from the real world perfectly, where the light sources are unclipped and the colors are correct and stuff like that. All you have to do is use the image as your environment background. And if your render engine supports it, it'll just emit light perfectly fine from the sun or whatever's in there. And that's the correct way to do it. But a lot of HDRIs online are not unclipped, so the photographer didn't like capture the full brightness of the sun, because it's a really hard thing to do. You need specific hardware. So for those, the HDRI itself is missing information, like it's missing light from the light source. So that's where you would need to add in your own sun lamp or whatever. Obviously, you have to first check, like, is the sun in this HDRI clipped or not? And if it is, then you have to add your own sunlight in the same place with the same direction.
And checking is just by basically looking at the sun and just doing levels on it, or
so you would take it into photo, or what's Krita, I guess. Krita works. GIMP actually works pretty well.
Yeah.
So you would reduce the exposure of the image. You could do it in Blender too, but Blender's not really meant for this kind of thing. You reduce the exposure of the image as far as you can, and you look at the light source. So if say the sun, if you start to see like the sun becoming gray, like it becomes a solid patch of gray, where it doesn't look natural. It looks like it's been overexposed, and you're now darkening it, and you get this like weird gray blob where the sun is supposed to be. Then it's clipped. It can be more subtle than that. It can be slightly colored, especially if it's some really colorful light source like LED strips or a tungsten lamp or something like that. But basically, if there's an area, even a couple of pixels, that is a solid color, usually gray, then it's clipped. But if you can reduce the brightness and keep going until you can see the sun as it is with like shading inside the disk itself, and keep going and it still looks natural, then it's unclipped. I've got an article that I guess you could link to in the show notes that explains how to look for this, and what difference it makes. Because it can be subtle. Like if you have some tungsten lights, you could have like 1 or 2 pixels clipped inside the filament of the light, and that changes it can be dramatic, even a couple of pixels, but it can also be quite subtle where like just the color of the lighting is off, and then the highlights of the reflections of that light source on your 3D model can be like more dull and discolored. So it can be subtle. It's hard to look for.
And so the other question related to that is that if you do happen to have one of these HDRIs that have insufficient lighting information specifically to the lighting source, what's the I mean, other than sort of just eyeballing it, what's the easiest way to sort of match the angle of the light source with your light object?
I don't know. But what I would do is I would just take one of my own HDRIs and just copy paste the sun and a bit of the sky around it into that other image, and then like eyeball the exposures to match each other and then blend them together. So then I have like a correct sun.
So you're still basically maintain the image based lighting workflow.
Yeah.
And don't even worry about throwing an extra lamp in the scene. That's
cool. So this is purely talking about path traced engines like Cycles,
right?
Because that's super important because it will get the lighting from the image itself. If you're dealing in real time with EV or game engines or anything like that, they don't do path traced image based lighting. They might do like path traced reflections and stuff, but they don't do that for the environment. So in those cases, you would usually need to add your own lamp. And I've done some work for some big studios, some big game studios where they really care about getting the accurate lighting from an HDRI into the game engine. And then what they would have me do is take a light meter and a color chart with me on a shoot, and then shoot the HDRI as it is, like as I usually do, unclipped and everything, and then take measurements of the intensity of the light on the color chart, in direct sunlight and in the shade. So by covering it and then doing the measurement. And then that allows them to like calculate what is the contribution of the sun in this HDRI. And then they can paint out the sun completely and add the sun back in their engine. And then they have the measurements to make sure it like matches correctly.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Okay.
That works really well. It's just a lot of work.
Yeah, I can imagine. So we're getting close to wrapping up. Cool. Where besides, well, I mean, HDRIhaven.com. Yeah, always get the last TLD on that one. So HDRIhaven.com is where you can go to HDRI Haven, and there are links from there to the other havens. And beyond that, where can people find you on the web?
I guess Twitter, and Twitter is pretty much the only thing I use is Greg Zaal, one word. I'm on GitHub as well, and you can follow along my work on the websites if you really care. We have a Discord server for the Haven websites. It's linked on the website as well, so you can find it there, and that's where our community mostly interacts, and we talk about all the things that we're planning to work on. Currently, we're having a big debate about the new logo design for the new website, Polyhaven, which will be the 3 merged into one.
Nice.
So it's useful.
So is that a public debate, or is that just sort of, that'd be fun to see.
We have some sections that are like private to patrons and stuff, but most of what we do is public.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, definitely worth taking a look at that.
Cool.
Cool. And the last one is: are there any questions that I haven't asked that you really wish that I would have asked so that I can ask them now?
um, nope, not that I can think of. Cool.
Yay! I'll consider myself thorough this time around.
Nice.
Well, Greg, thanks a bunch for agreeing
Yeah.
to be on the show. It's great to have you, and everyone check out HDRI Haven. You can use it for 3D stuff, or if you just need image environments of cool stuff and chop it up and put it as a background for your desktop, because sometimes people still do that.
Yeah.
That's a great way of doing it as well.
Cool.
Thanks
All
a
right.
lot.
Thank you.
And that's our talk. Thanks a lot to Greg for agreeing to be a guest. For me, like I said during the talk, it's really cool to see that it's possible to actually make a living with open content, and it seems making a better making a better living than what was made when the content was closed. Which, yeah, Greg pointed out that his geography and his personal situation matter in that case, but maybe you're in a different unique position where open content can also work for you as well. There's never just one way to do things, right? There's always multiple ways and multiple avenues to attack a particular scenario and make things work. So the point is that the model of free and open source content, free and open source software, it does work. It is sustainable, and there are ways of handling that are very good. And it's not something that people should be doubting anymore. But if there are, we have examples to show otherwise, both in the software and on the content world. So boom, there we go. In any case, what parts did you find interesting? What parts do you want to talk about? Let me know. You can comment on the episode in episode 51, because I actually have comments again. Yay! And just go on opensourcecreative.org, look for episode 51, and you can make a comment there. And as always, you can also track me down on your favorite social media site. Just look for Monster Java Guns, because that's easier to spell than my actual name. And then you can tell me what you think there. I also happen to have an email newsletter. Signing up for that as easily as going to opensourcecreative.org and going to the little contact page there and clickety-clacketing from there, and we can have a good old time doing the mailing list thing. All right. Feels good. Let's do this. Now it's time to get back to work.
And this is the last job.
That was my wave goodbye.
Oh, that's going in the
Nice.
outtake.